Hi, everyone. Nice to see you today. Some of you who are here, and nice to see those of you who will be here watching the recording. So my name is Natalie Hoidel. I am an extension educator with the University of Minnesota. I work with local foods and vegetable crops, and I am based in Farmington in Dakota County. I live in Dakota County, so it's nice to connect with you all. And today I'm going to be talking about growing vegetables in a changing climate. So just to start out, let's talk a little bit about why it matters. What are the connections between climate change and gardening? So one of the most obvious reasons to talk about this is that in certain ways, climate change will make gardening a bit more challenging. In some ways, has already made gardening more challenging. But also, climate change or gardening can play a role in mitigation. A small role in mitigation and a role in adaptation. So mitigation is actually fixing a problem, whereas adaptation is just being able to adapt to a problem and continue to be able to provide our communities with healthy foods, access to nature and green space, and we can continue to make our gardens and soils more resilient to our changing climate. So outline for today, we're going to talk just kind of really big picture, 10,000 foot view about climate change trends and predictions. And then we're going to do kind of a deep dive into these two major predictions. So preparing for more water, that's the thing that we'll spend the most time on since that has the most direct impacts to vegetable crops. And then we'll talk about preparing for warmer winters as well. And finally, talk a little bit about building soil health. If you were at the regional gatherings this year, we did more of a deep dive into soil health and we're building some resources for that. So we're just going to kind of quick go through some key points at the end. So one of the things that is worth talking about when we talk about climate change is just the fact that we've always had an extreme climate. And so it's important to have some perspective. I think every year you'll probably hear people saying things like, oh, it's a warm winter this year, it must be climate change, things like that. But we have to take kind of a longer view to really understand trends. So just some examples of how extreme our climate can be. In Minnesota, we have temperatures up to as high as 115 degrees. That was recorded in Big Stone County, down to negative 62 degrees. In St. Louis County, in a single day, we had a shift of 72 degrees in Couchiching County. So we are people who are used to really significant temperature extremes, as well as precipitation. We've had as much as 15 inches of rain in a single day. It was in 2007. And we've gone 79 days without water. So just some kind of big picture perspective on how extreme our climate is already. So when we look at the long-term changes, there are a couple things that we are really quite certain about, and then some things that are strong trends that maybe are a little bit less certain. So the things that we know are very certain, we have a high confidence level, are that we're experiencing higher temperature lows. So basically, our winter lows are not getting as low. We're not experiencing those deep freezes as often or as intensely. And I'll show some graphs to expand on that a little bit more. The other thing that we're seeing is more intense rain events. So when it rains, more rain at a given time. Some things that we're also seeing that we have a fairly high certainty about, saying that these are trends that we expect to continue, are longer, more intense heat waves and more days between rain. So not only are we seeing more rain and more intense rain, but in the middle of that, we're also seeing longer heat waves and droughts. So just to kind of show you what that looks like, this series of images here on the left show precipitation changes in Minnesota over the last 100 years or so, a little bit more than 100 years. And you can see across the state, almost every region of the state is getting more rain than it did 100 years ago. There are parts that have gone from this kind of dark green area, 26 to 28 inches, that are now experiencing more than 30 inches. So it's only a few inches, but that few inches of rain actually has a significant effect on climate. And then when we have that more intense rainfall, we tend to see the more significant increases in the spring and in the fall. And this is just to kind of expand upon this idea of heavier rain events. So looking at heavy rain events, we can see basically up until from 1860s to 1960s, there were about 4 mega rain events every 100 years. And now in the last, since 2000, we've had 5 mega rain events in only 14 years. So this graph here in the middle shows when it rains, how much harder is it raining. So from 1958 to now, so about the last 50 years, basically when it rains now, there's about 37% more rainfall in that rain event. So just heavier rains overall, as well as more rain. And then looking a little bit more in depth, about temperature, overall, our climate is becoming warmer. That's kind of one of the foundational pieces of how climate change is affecting Minnesota. And in sometimes we see this spun in a positive way. So this was from the Pioneer Press, basically saying, look, our USDA zones are shifting. That means we can grow warmer crops. And so that it's sometimes been portrayed as a good thing, but we'll see that there are also some negative effects of that as well. So in particular, we're having these warmer winters. The winters are actually warming 13 times faster than the summers in Minnesota. So we're not seeing the really intense heat effects as much in the summer as we're just seeing less intense cold in the winter. And this here graph is just the lowest temperature each year. And you can see the lowest temperature in the 70s was around negative 25, and there's been this pretty steady increase. Now our lowest temperatures hover more around negative 15 degrees. And this is again just kind of reinforcing this idea that the changes we're seeing are more in the winter than in the summer. So even though we've had an annual average of about 2 degrees Fahrenheit increase, and that is a little bit different depending on where you are in the state, 2.3 in the north, the winter lows have changed about 4 degrees in the middle of the state, almost 5 degrees in the northern part of the state, but the summer lows really haven't changed much at all. It's less than 1 degree. And just kind of a wrap up of these projections. Basically, we don't really know what the future looks like. There's still a lot to be determined. This is from the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, and their predictions from their latest report, basically saying that here's where we're at right now. This black line here on the left is kind of the changes that we've seen already. And then all of these different lines are based on different scenarios of reducing emissions. So if we can really significantly reduce emissions, we may see less than a 2 degree Celsius increase. If we don't do anything at all to reduce emissions, we could see up to a 5 or 6 degrees Celsius increase. So there's still a lot to be determined for how our future climate's going to look. So that was kind of the 10,000-foot view. So basically, just to reiterate, more water, more intense water, and our winters are not as cold as they used to be. So now we're going to kind of zero in on these two different trends, more water and warmer winters, and think about what that actually means in practice for growing vegetables and growing gardens. And I'm going to just make sure, no, we don't have any questions yet. So I chunked this out into 4 different challenges. Our water changes are basically affecting us in terms of creating wetter fields that are harder to get into on time, more disease pressure, some physiological issues, and then we'll touch on these drought impacts as well. So wet soil is a major challenge in gardening. If you've ever had a garden and experienced a really, really wet spring where it's just kind of mucky out there and it's hard to get into your garden on time, it can be hard to get your crops into the field on time. Another impact of this is that when you're out working in wet soil, that leads to compaction. So when your soil is wet and you're walking on it, using tools on it, especially if you're using equipment on it, that compacts your soil and leads to reduced quality in your soil structure. So some solutions, thinking about ways that we can manage wetter soil. Things like raised beds are a really simple, good solution. When you have raised beds, they help to drain water out faster. Solutions like tarping, I'm seeing more and more gardeners, especially on a kind of a community garden scale, use things like used billboard tarps or silage tarps to essentially just cover the soil in the spring so that you can just block the water out, take it off, and have a drier field to come into. Things like site selection are going to become increasingly important. So choosing garden sites that drain really well, that have a little bit more sand in the soil versus clay. I'm seeing more and more people invest in landscape modification. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what all of this means. Tunnels are also becoming more common in gardens, not just high tunnels, but low tunnels, kind of DIY caterpillar tunnels. I'll show some examples of that. And then really investing in mulches and organic matter to absorb some of that water. So we'll look at each of these solutions. So raised beds, I think when we think of raised beds, we often think of this bottom picture here, your standard wooden sided raised beds. But you can definitely do just raised beds in the soil. This is not the greatest picture, but this is a picture from my garden. We decided to go from a flat garden to actually doing raised beds this year to help that water drain off. And raised beds also have the advantage of allowing you a really easy way to add things like wood chips, perennial covers like white clover between your beds. And this allows for better drainage, better access as well. So you're not like walking through the mud to get to your plots, as well as concentrated compaction. So if we have to walk on wet soils, if we can concentrate that to a small area that we're always walking on and leaving our beds open to be nice and fluffy and not compacted, that's going to be a better situation in the long run. So I mentioned tarping. This here is a photo of a used billboard tarp over a field. So basically I'm seeing growers use this to get into their fields earlier. They'll put it out in say March or so, take it off in May, and it kind of keeps the 2-month period of precipitation off of the place where you're going to be growing your vegetables. This method also has weed control benefits. You're essentially using solarization or occultation. Solarization would be clear plastic, occultation using dark plastic. So you get a weed control benefit from that. We also see nitrate retention. So nitrogen binds to water more tightly than it does to soil. And so in that period where you have water kind of melting, you have the snow melting, ice melting, and running through the soil profile, that's a time when we see a lot of nutrient leaching, especially nitrogen leaching. And so blocking that water is a way to kind of hold on to that nitrogen. And cover crops will do the same thing, having living roots in the soil to hold it in the top part of the soil profile. This isn't a solution for everyone. It's just an example of something that I see a lot of folks starting to do as a way to manage too much water. It is a challenge to hold them down sometimes. They can blow away. And it's also plastic waste. Hopefully you can get a used tarp, used billboard, but those are some downsides. So landscape modification it sounds extreme, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So this is kind of thinking about your landscape and how water moves across it. Maybe you've got a slope in your landscape, and so water tends to move down that slope. Something as simple as a strip of perennial vegetation, like we have here in this photo on the left. More extreme examples would be things like berms, rain gardens with channels to catch some of that water. Here on top is a picture of Frogtown Farm, where they've done a really nice job with berms and creating essentially like terraces along their hillsides, where they're growing fruit trees on each of those terraces as a way to capture that water so it's not just flowing off the sides of the hilltop. And then tunnels. So we'll talk a little bit more about the implications of splashing water when we talk about pathogen management and diseases. But one of the big things that comes along with more water is more pathogen pressure. So you've got rainfall splashing on the soil, bringing up diseases. And so by using a tunnel, you can keep that water off of your plants and then use drip irrigation for a little bit more control. And I think we think of tunnels like this tunnel on the bottom left, kind of big high tunnels for farmers. And if you work in community gardens, there are more and more opportunities through the NRCS, the EQIP program, to help get funding for tunnels. But even on a small scale, you can do tunnels in a very affordable DIY kind of way, and that you get a lot of the same benefits from those. And then the final thing I'll talk about with just kind of managing more water on the landscape is the idea of mulches. So natural mulches, things like straw, wood chips, living mulches, like cover crops, are really important for kind of long-term soil structure in managing all of this additional water. So you're adding organic matter to your soil when you do this. These mulches improve water retention. So it's not just running off the surface, they help to kind of keep that water where it's landing. And then there are side benefits. So things like weed suppression. In some cases, if you're using cover crops, especially flowering cover crops, you can have benefits for pollinators, habitat for beneficial insects. So really thinking about how we can add mulches to keep the soil covered, or cover crops to keep the soil covered, is going to be really important for managing excess water. Plastic mulch is also an option that we see a lot of growers moving towards, especially farmers, commercial growers. It offers some of these same benefits. It reduces splashing. It can help retain moisture really well, keep a really consistent moisture in the soil profile. It's not improving water retention. It's not building organic matter, not providing habitat. So plastic mulch is not at all doing the same thing that cover crops or some of these natural mulches like straw are doing. But it can provide you some essentially insurance against splashing and fluctuating water levels. So the second challenge of more water is more disease. So as kind of a general rule, most plant pathogens thrive in humid conditions. And so when we have more water, more splashing, more humidity, we tend to see more disease pressure. And so we could do a whole talk about this. Disease management is a really big topic. But in general, we all are going to need to get more careful, basically, and become more thoughtful about how we're managing pathogens in the landscape and managing in a way that prevents disease pressure. So starting with seed, using clean seed. If you're saving seed, making sure you're hot water treating your seed to prevent carryover pathogens from year to year. Growing healthy transplants. So making sure if you're buying transplants or starting seeds at home, making sure you're just kind of checking them, making sure they look healthy, making sure you're not seeing signs of disease before you put those in your garden. Things like cleaning equipment as often as possible, wearing clean clothes and boots. This is one of the most challenging things, I think, is people think about, like, you're in your garden, and so you're going to put on kind of your grubby clothes and your dirty boots. But our clothes and our boots transmit pathogens. And so making sure that you're wearing clean clothes to the garden and cleaning off your boots regularly has a pretty significant effect on disease management. Anytime you have soil blowing across fields, you have water moving across fields, those are ways that pathogens move. And so working to reduce water moving across the landscape, we talked about that before with adding strips of vegetation, like perennial vegetation, cleaning equipment, cleaning harvest bins and whatnot. Basically just practicing really good sanitation is really key. So Janice, you asked if I was going to share a resource document, and I will actually, so I can include some of this information. So starting with clean seed includes buying from reputable sources. If you're buying from seed companies, looking for resistant varieties. If you're saving seed, make sure you're only doing that from healthy plants. If you can see that a plant is clearly sick, it's going to be more likely to transmit that disease with its seed. and then hot water treatment. So I'll include a link to hot water treatment and how to do that in the resource document. But it's a simple, easy thing to do. It's quick, and it can make a really big difference. Using resistant varieties as often as possible. So if you are seeing pathogens in your garden, making sure to identify those pathogens. The University of Minnesota has a plant disease clinic where you can send plants to get identified or to identify pathogens in your plants. It costs about $45, but if it's a crop that you really care about, like if you really care about growing great tomatoes every year, make sure that you're identifying the diseases so that you can look for resistant varieties. Good crop rotation. I think in a lot of gardens, it's really hard to practice crop rotation just because we have limited space. And so it can be really hard to do it adequately. But basically, do your best. The ideal crop rotation is about 3 to 4 years for a family. So if you planted tomatoes in this bed this year, make sure you're not planting tomatoes, eggplants, potatoes, peppers, everything in that solanaceous family for 3 to 4 years again. And having raised beds is a really nice way to kind of separate your spaces so that you can practice crop rotation, using things like containers so that you're not having to plant things in the same soil every year. Those are some ways to kind of get around it. And also then just make sure that you are doing a little bit of research to make sure that you know what family the crops that you're growing are in. So this is an example of all of the different cole crops. I know we often know that broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage are in the same family, but making sure you also know that things like radishes, turnips, some of these Asian greens, bok choy are in that family as well, will help you to make sure that you're practicing good rotations. Another general cultural management strategy is to just be thoughtful about how you're moving through your garden. So one really easy way to do this is to start your day in the youngest and healthiest plants and move towards the older plants and the sicker plants at the end of the day. So assuming that the younger plants are going to be healthier, the older plants have been out longer, they've been exposed to more things. And so you're starting with the healthiest and moving towards the sickest. And if you're in an area where your plants are really, really diseased, just end your day there, basically. Don't go from that area into an area with healthy plants. So again, we could do a whole lecture on disease management, but just kind of hitting home these points of sanitation and really good cultural management are going to be really important moving forward as we have more rain and more intense rain. So the third challenge with excess water is physiological issues. And this comes from basically fluctuating moisture for a lot of vegetables, especially in the critical period. So the critical period, for the most part, is flowering through fruit set, or if it's a root or a tuber, it's the time when the plant is starting to develop that root or tuber. So in that critical period, fluctuating moisture levels result in a lot of different physiological problems. So this is hollow heart in potato. This is something I've noticed in, honestly, most of the farmers market potatoes that I've bought over the last couple of years. Blossom end rot, many of you are probably familiar with. Often the first tomatoes have blossom end rot, no matter how well you're managing. But if you're seeing more blossom end rot throughout the year, that's a sign that you have really inconsistent moisture in your garden. Things like yellow shoulder are complicated, but related to fluctuating moisture levels. And so things like investing in good drainage so that you're not getting flooding in your soil. So if you have a raised bed and there's a really heavy rain event, it's going to help that water drain out of the system so your plants aren't just sitting in water. Monitoring soil moisture. So I think a lot of people will irrigate their crops kind of like, say it's been really hot for a week or your plants are starting to wilt, you'll go out and water them. Or some people water on a schedule, like every 3 days, I'm going to go out and water no matter what. And so instead, kind of shifting your mindset to focus on consistent soil moisture, going out and feeling your soil. If it feels dry, make sure you're watering. I think there's some difficult psychology about irrigating after a heavy rainfall. So like it just rained a lot and now you've got a dry period. And a lot of folks will think like, oh, like this dry period is really important because I've been having disease pressure and this will be really good for things to be able to just dry out a little bit. But often it's those periods after a really heavy rainfall where if the plant experiences even a little bit of drought, that change is where we start to see a lot of these physiological diseases, but they're not diseases, physiological disorders. So just honing in on more consistent moisture in the garden will really help to deal with some of these weather changes. And so then that brings us to the fourth challenge, which is being ready for more drought. Drought is, I think over the last 5 years or so, we've had such wet weather that we think of wet weather as being this major challenge to gardening, but drought can be even more challenging. So drought and high temperatures can do a lot of different things to our crops. These are just some examples. I don't know if I'm gonna go through every single one of them, but tomatoes, we tend to see more sun scald, fruit cracking. The tomatoes actually have less nutrients in their tissues when they experience drought and heat stress. In cucurbits especially, we see a lot of blossom drop. So the plants will produce flowers and then they'll just fall off, or they'll start to produce a fruit and they'll just let it go. So that's one thing that we've seen over the last couple of years, people really struggling to grow squash, cucumbers, just because the flowers will kind of drop off and not produce anything. Things like hollow stem and broccoli, really fibrous roots and carrots. So basically, we can't do a whole lot about really high temperatures, but practices like irrigating when it's really hot can help your plants kind of get through those really hot stages. Focusing on soil health as well. So if you can build up your organic matter, your soil will naturally hold on to more water. And then also thinking about irrigation. So I know infrastructure is kind of sounds a little intimidating or a little more like something a farmer would do. But just thinking about like, if you don't have drip irrigation in your garden, that's maybe something to think about as we anticipate warmer summers and these heat waves. Also thinking about variety selection. So when you're looking through a seed catalog, looking at things like heat tolerance can help you choose a variety, especially if it's going to be a crop, like a fall crop, like broccoli or lettuce that you plant in the summer, like in August when it's really hot, but it's actually a cool season crop. Looking for heat tolerance in those kind of crops is going to be really important and helpful. And then determinate versus indeterminate varieties. There's some evidence that determinate varieties, so the ones that stay short in stature, so determinate varieties kind of maintain their short stature. They're more of a bush habit. They produce all of their flowers and fruit at once, whereas indeterminate are climbing habit. So thinking mostly about tomatoes, they keep producing fruit. And with a determinate variety, if you have a heat wave right as the plant is producing all of its flowers and fruit, that can really get in the way of production. Whereas with an indeterminate variety, it's more of this kind of constant process. And so say you have a really significant heat wave the first week of August, that plant can kind of move through it and will continue to put resources into flowering and fruiting throughout the season. And so there are maybe more chances for those crops to catch up. So I know this is a lot of content, so we're going to take a little pause here. And I know that many of you are watching this via a recording, but a few of you are here directly. So I'm going to ask you, all of you, even those of you who are watching via recording, to share any additional strategies that you have used to manage unpredictable weather. And I'll just give maybe 30 seconds or so for you to do that. And if folks put them in right now, I can read some of those off. And for those of you who are watching the recording, I will still be there. And so we can go through some of those at the end of the presentation. So I'll just give a second for that. All right. And feel free to keep putting in answers as we go, if you think of something along the way. Okay, so that was all about managing excess water. And so now we're going to look at preparing for warmer winters. And this is going to be a little less intense because there's a little bit less to say about this for vegetables. Warmer winters are a big problem for fruit crops and perennials. But for vegetable gardens, there are fewer effects. So, like I said, warmer winters are a big problem for fruit. And some of the basic reason for that is that we have these warm temperatures earlier in the season. So in January, February, we're having these really warm days. And essentially, that triggers the plants to say, oh, it must be spring, so I'm going to put my buds out. So the plants have bud break earlier in the season. And then we have these late spring freezes. So they're not actually late. Like in previous years, it would be totally normal to have a hard freeze in March, or at least into late February. But because the plant has already experienced this warm weather, they put out their buds, and then we have a freeze. And when the plant has already produced a bud or a flower, it's significantly more susceptible to cold injury. So just to give you a sense of kind of how significant this trend has been, we can look at this graph on the left. And I know there's kind of a lot going on, but we can start with the really dark blue part. So that's from 1956 to 1975. This is showing both the duration of sub-zero temperatures and the intensity. So basically from around January 27th, 28th until February, maybe 15th or so, temperatures at night were getting below zero, and they were getting fairly substantially below zero. Or sorry, this is below 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So the average temperature would be as low as about 6 degrees at the coldest part of the season. And that period of cold weather would last a long time. Then if we look at the middle blue, that kind of lighter blue from 1976 to 1995, we can see in January, early January, it was still getting just as cold, more or less. But then getting into late January to mid-January into February, those temperatures were not getting as cold. But that below 10 degree season was still lasting into February 7th or so. But then if we look at the lightest blue, 1996 to 2015, you can see that the period where we're getting below 10 degrees Fahrenheit on average for the daily average temperature is only lasting from January 17th to the 25th or so. So that period went from over a month, almost a month and a half, to only about a week where we have daily average temperatures below 10 degrees. And then you can see that the average temperature is actually only about 9.5 degrees instead of 6 degrees. So a much shorter period of cold weather, and the intensity of the cold is less. And then by 2040, if these predictions continue, we're going to have 27 fewer freeze days, so that we've almost lost a month of freezing temperatures. And I know I said I wasn't going to talk about fruit. I'm going to do just a couple of slides just to give a little bit of background. This is more my colleague Annie's area of expertise, but just to give you a sense. So basically this shows that as bud break, as the buds open up and become flowers, the temperature at which they experience injury becomes higher and higher. So in apple, if you're at silvertip before the buds have broken, you can get down to about 2 degrees before 90% of those trees will experience injury. Once they've started to blossom, say at this first pink stage, it's 24 degrees where 90% of those trees will experience injury. So just sort of reiterating here, the trees put out their blossoms earlier, and that makes them substantially more at risk of cold injury. And so that kind of brings about a question in fruit breeding and variety selection. Traditionally, when we talk about fruit varieties that are well suited to Minnesota, we've talked about hardiness. But more and more, because we're not having these cold winters anymore, the hardiness is less important than the timing of bud break, basically. So varieties that are later to bloom are less likely to have that kind of early confusion where they bloom and then it's still winter and so they experience the freeze. So later blooming varieties may actually be more important to the resilience of our fruit crops in the future than cold hardiness. Actually sorry, I've got a cough here. The U of M has a lot of information about this for apples if you have any interest in planting apple trees. And I think in the future, we'll see more investment in this kind of work with other fruit. So in general, this is both for vegetables and fruit. We're seeing more and more people want to grow food year round. And I showed earlier that article from the Pioneer Press that basically was framing climate change as an opportunity because our growing zones are changing. And to some extent, that is true. We're seeing people growing spinach all winter long in unheated tunnels. And part of the way that we're able to do that is with row cover. So you can put row cover on anything like strawberries, raspberries, vegetables. Row cover is about $19 for a 50-foot bed. There are folks there are basically two ways to do it. This top picture is with hoops, so that lifts the row cover off of your plants. And there are also ways where you can just spread it out over your crop, like these strawberries here on the bottom. There are kind of pros and cons to both. The hoops obviously cost something. They're about $50 for 25 hoops. You can also make them yourself with PVC, or you can buy pipe benders to bend steel pipes. And yeah, if you do the hoop method, that helps to regulate humidity a little bit. It kind of keeps your row cover from being directly on top of the plants, which can lead to some condensation. It's less windy under the row covers. It is higher humidity. And so this has a lot of benefits. You can have earlier fruiting if you're doing this on fruit crops. And we also tend to see higher yields when you do this. And this also would allow you to start growing some of those shoulder season crops, like the cool season lettuce and broccoli, things like that, up to a few weeks earlier in the spring, and then allow them to mature a few weeks later into the fall. So I'll just mention this project. So there are a lot of ways that people are trying to figure out how to keep their crops protected through the winter. This was a SARE grant looking at different protection materials. And this person tested row cover, plastic barrels. So we actually put a plastic barrel on top of each plant. He tried straw, and then he actually got a snow machine and made his own snow and covered the plants in it. And the row cover was the most effective. So in terms of keeping your plants going through the winter, if you're testing varieties that are maybe not as cold hardy, row cover is a way to help you kind of get through those winter months. In general, when we're talking about annual crops like vegetables, warmer winters are a lot less damaging. They don't matter as much because your crop doesn't have to get through the winter. But the one kind of downside is that we're seeing more potential for insect and weed problems. So when it doesn't get as cold in the winter, there are insects that are becoming more able to overwinter, whereas before they would have died from the cold. There are insects that are gaining generations. So just like we're able to push our broccoli production a few weeks later, there are insects that are adding a whole additional generation to their life cycles. And then with weed problems as well, the timeline for when a weed is going to germinate is going to be a little bit earlier. And when we combine that with these wetter falls and springs, it means that the weeds may have an advantage because it's warmer, so they are germinating, they're getting established, but it's still too wet for you to get into your field. So that's where combining some of these strategies for having wetter fields can also help with the impacts of how weeds are responding to climate change. So with all of that, just going to give a couple examples of building soil health. Soil health is one of the foundations of resilience to climate change. Again, healthier soil holds onto water better, it holds onto nutrients better. And so those are some ways that we can build resilience in our gardens. So that ability to hold on to water better and nutrients comes from more organic matter as well as aggregate stability. And so again, that allows soils to hold on to water in times of flooding and also times of droughts. And we also see that soils with higher organic matter, higher aggregate stability, have more microbial diversity and abundance. And so we're building these healthier soil profiles overall that are more resilient. So one really important way to do this, one of the best ways that gardeners have to build their soil, is through cover crops. So you're adding organic matter. The roots of cover crops feed soil microbes. They're capturing nutrients. They're retaining them in the soil profile. Cover crops help with erosion control, which with more intense weather events, we can expect more erosion. They can reduce compaction and crusting. And this is less important for gardeners, but if you've been tilling your garden for a long time, you likely have a plow pan from the bottom of your rototiller. And so cover crops can help to break through that and have a more kind of cohesive soil profile that your roots can go through. So if you were at the regional gatherings, you saw this. I'm not going to go as in depth here at all, but just to give you some examples of ways you can use cover crops in your garden. With pretty much any crop, after you harvest, you can put in a winter cover crop as late as probably late August, earlier September if you're in the north, and in our region, mid to late September. We can also put in spring cover crops before we plant. There are plenty of crops that we plant around midsummer, like carrots, fall brassicas, and so a spring cover crop, it's a great way to keep your soil covered until then and to add some organic matter. Same with late summer or fall cover crops. There are, just like there are crops that we plant at midsummer and harvest in the fall, there are crops we plant in the spring and harvest around midsummer. And so following that with a late season cover crop. And then finally, there are opportunities for summer cover crops. If you're doing, say, like an early season lettuce, and then you're not going to plant until fall with like a watermelon radish or something, you can fit a summer cover crop in between. And I'll put this in the resources as well, but this is my favorite tool for cover crops, the cover crop decision tool. You can put in your state, you can put in your county, and then your goals. So things like weed fighter, adds nitrogen to the soil. There's this list of goals that you can get from the cover crop, pollinator habitat. And it gives you this really excellent, really user-friendly chart about all of the different cover crops that are available and the windows that it makes sense to plant them. So as you're planning your garden, you can think about ways that you can fit cover crops in. Another way to add resilience to your garden, to add organic matter, is just to add compost. If you're doing this, if you're adding compost regularly, make sure that you're not over fertilizing. We are seeing research come out that in the Twin Cities, there are these series of plots that are being monitored by an urban ag research team, and they're seeing that they are over fertilized to the point that they're having phosphorus issues. And so definitely add compost, but make sure that you're also testing your soil every couple of years and don't rely too heavily on animal manure, which is really high in phosphorus. And then the final thing I'm just going to really briefly mention is reducing tillage. So tilling your garden, if you're in the practice of rototilling your garden every spring or every fall, tillage ultimately, it disrupts soil microbial communities. It breaks up aggregates, which are really key to soil structure. It compacts your soil over time, even though in the short term it's adding aeration. And basically, you're breaking your soil into smaller and smaller pieces. And so over time, that gives your soil less water holding capacity and also much more potential for erosion. So that was a lot of material, but just to kind of recap it all, some things that we can expect as a result of climate change. We can expect wetter weather, more rain, more intense rainfall events. And I gave you a couple tools to think about in terms of designing your gardens accordingly to handle that additional water. Expect warmer winters. That is especially a problem for fruit. In an annual garden, it's not as much of an issue, but also think about ways that you can use those warmer winters to maybe grow greens throughout the winter. You continue to feed yourself, feed the people around you through your garden. And while soil is not necessarily like the end all be all, it's not the solution to all of this. If we can capture some carbon in our gardens and just focus on building like really healthy soils, those soils can be more resilient to these changes in the long term. And so moving forward, I think a lot of this is, it's really easy to talk about these concepts. It's a lot harder to do them. But the more that we have examples and the more that we're sharing with each other, I think the more we can adapt. And so I think the Master Gardener program is a really great way to do that, because you have a lot of really committed gardeners who are trying new things. So using your network to showcase people who are doing really good work, people who are experimenting with cover crops or mulches, basically any of these practices, share them with each other so that you can learn from each other and kind of grow and figure these things out together. And so that is all that I had prepared, and I'm happy to talk through questions or ideas. These are some ways that you can connect with our team. So we have the Yard and Garden news as well as the fruit and vegetable news. Those go out every week. So fruit and vegetable goes out every single week during the growing season, and then every 2 weeks in the winter. Yard and Garden goes out every 2 weeks. So that's where we're constantly posting the most up-to-date information we have about the growing season, things that you should be doing in your garden, and where we have a lot more in-depth content about a lot of the concepts that I talked about today. So with that, thank you all for listening, and I will be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Natalie. That was wonderful.